What's going on, guys? Exciton Elimination 21 has just wrapped up, and as usual, I want to take a look at this event and look over the top 3 deck lists from this tournament, see what actually managed to take the top spots, look over the list, see if there was any cool tech choices or, fun techs that started popping up, and just take a look at the overall event. I know you guys have been missing these types of videos, as when I was at the NAWCQ, there were 2 different online hat format tournaments that wrapped up, and unfortunately I wasn't able to make a video on those because I was at the NAWCQ, and I always try to put out this information as quickly as possible for you guys, and I didn't want to put it out like multiple days after the event. I know for a lot of you guys you probably wouldn't have cared, but for me personally, I want to again just get you guys that information as quickly as possible. So here we are back with another one, and if you guys want to play in some of these online hat format tournaments, I highly suggest going down to the video description and finding the link for the Hat Alliance Discord server. They host a bunch of different online hat format tournaments, some small, some big. Most of them are free to play in, and they're played on Dueling Book and stuff, and so just go join that Discord server. Again, all that information is in the video description. But anyways, guys, let's start talking about this event. So for this event, it was, usually the Exciton eliminations are a little bit smaller, somewhere between 12 to 15-ish players, and they have slowly been going up in numbers. This one was actually 17 players, and I don't entirely remember how much the last one was, but it was a pretty decent and pretty similar size as well. So these tournaments are starting to grow in numbers, so that is something nice to actually keep in mind, as hat format is slowly growing and gaining popularity. I know locally for me, a lot more people are starting to actually get interested in it, just for me, like bringing hat format decks to locals and stuff, and then also just putting out these videos constantly. A lot of people are starting to watch it more and start to actually get an appreciation for the actual format, so it's really great to see that. But anyways, looking at what decks actually entered this tournament, there were 5 Geargia, so honestly, usually we are seeing a lot of Geargia in these tournaments. Lately, they had been dying down a little bit, but seeing how dominant that Geargia was in this event, it'll be very interesting to see how many actually took those top spots. After that, 3 Artifact Trap Tricks, which is, again, usually one of the bigger numbers, as these are just kind of the best go-to decks of the format in terms of just they're very grindy, they're very consistent, and they do what they do well. But similarly, Mermail actually also had 3 spots, which Mermail has slowly been picking back up in popularity. For a while it died down, and I've said this before, but it's coming into light a little bit more. So, it's nice to see that actually evened out with the Artifact Trap Tricks variants, which is really cool to see. Other than that, there was 1 Harpy, 1 Koikimiru Fire Fist, 1 Mythic Ruler, 1 Madolche, 1 Artifact Thunder, and 1 Laval. Very interesting to see that Laval. I feel like we barely ever see that deck. I know there's a lot of different versions, and I plan to show off a couple of those versions in the future. There's like an Artifact version, there's a more like Banish Fire version, and just some cool stuff with that. But overall, I guess for a smaller event, it's a decent amount of different decks. At the same time, like, I want to say that half of this just feels very, standard, or a little over half. And even then, there's only a couple like random one-ofs, but there are some, like I mentioned, Laval or Harpy, for example, that you don't really even see that often in the bigger events. So that is pretty cool to see. Again, no one really brought like Lightsworn Ruler, the Infernity decks, Sylvan. Surprisingly, no Spellbook either. That's kind of a interesting thing to note there. We did see 1 Mythic Ruler, so there was at least some form of ruler decks in there. But overall, yeah, no, it's actually a little interesting. People are really just going with the Geargia Artifact Trap Tricks, and then Mermail, which has a good matchup usually into the Geargia and Artifact Trap Tricks matchups, so that is cool to note. But you guys can let me know what you found interesting about the actual breakdown, and let's actually see what topped this event. So in first place, we actually had Madolche. So, that one Madolche player was able to make it. Skill Drain is the person who I've shown off on the channel a handful of times. Their username on Dueling Book is alt with no name, and they have been trying to kind of perfect Madolche for a very long time. And it's kind of funny because I think it was yesterday or a couple days before, they actually had messaged me. We've talked in the past, and they said how they finally think they broke Madolche to the point where, not like breaking it, but they finally figured out the right ratios and everything that felt good with the deck. So to actually see them take this event is kind of ironic. They had sent in some replays and stuff, and now it's like, do I go with the old replays or am I going to show off the ones from this event in general? So that's really cool to see. In second place was one of those Geargia decks, which was Swisky. I think I've shown them off in some of the replay reviews as well. Not as many, but I feel like I probably might have some. I show off so many replay reviews on the channel that sometimes I lose track of the usernames and stuff like that. But cool to see that Geargia got second. I believe this was Geargia Hands as well, so not the pure variant, but with hands. And I think actually the Madolche deck is also with hands. Usually Madolche Hands is the more commonly played version. I know people have also messed with like artifacts, and a couple people messed with pure. And then after that, in third place, we have Icaros, another player that I've shown off a ton, and they obviously, even looking down into other formats here, they are winning events in other formats as well, and they are just a really good player. And they were playing Mermail, and this I actually did see a little bit into it, and I heard a little bit about their list. I haven't done a deep dive into it, so it'll be cool to look at this in a minute, but from what I heard, they actually weren't on Genix Undyne, which sounds crazy when you think about Mermail, just because it is one of those decks that being able to summon Undyne usually is very strong, sending for cost, so you guarantee that you can either break a board or, get your Dragoons Engrave or, some of your other cards without having to deal with things like breakthrough skill and stuff. So it will be very cool to see their list as well. But overall, that is the top three. And so let's go and take a look at that first place deck list. So here we have the Madolche Hands deck list, and just at a quick glance for the main deck, there's a couple things I noticed right away. The first of which is just two copies of H.A.T, my apologies, and this is something that a lot of players have kind of realized, that a lot of times you'd rather just get this off of Angeli, and as a result, you don't really want to be opening multiple copies of this if you don't have a way to already go and get into, being able to use its effect. So cutting down on this actually feels pretty nice. I know when I was, messing with this deck a lot more, that was kind of something that I also had the idea of. In terms of anything else, I feel like one copy of Mewtwo is also something that people sometimes want to play more of, but it just feels like one of those cards that just loses so hard to Breakthrough Skill and Fiendish Chain and a bunch of other things, but it is very powerful with the Angeli. But anyways, this is a kind of a normal ratio. I just wanted to say that when playing two copies of H.A.T, sometimes people would prefer more copies of Angeli or something like that, because at bare minimum, if you summon the Mewtwo and have a H.A.T, you can at least make a rank 3. But anyways, going into the other thing is one copy of Messengelato. For the longest time, a lot of players were playing more than this, usually playing 2 copies, and that's simply because if you draw it, it's really unfortunate, because you want to be able to summon this off of the H.A.T usually, and be able to get a search for your Chateau or ticket. So playing only one is a little more risky, but it kind of comes down to that situation where, for example, in like more modern Yu-Gi-Oh, or I guess a little bit in the past now at this point, with things like Cyframe Gamma and Driver, it's like, how many Driver do you play in case you want, or even like Garnet, for example, how many do you play, because if you happen to open it, then you want to still be able to resolve the good card, and so they chose to just do one, and obviously it worked out for them, and I guess there's a less likelihood of actually drawing it if you only play one. It's just high risk, high reward, but really cool to see that. The other thing is, for the hands, they went with 3 and 3. This deck notoriously would go with 2 and 2 for the most part, and a lot of times that just comes down to this deck has a lot of normal summons. Like if you look at the Mewtwo's a normal summon, the Magellans are normal summons, H.A.T can be a normal summon, and Jellies, and then all the hands. But I guess at the same time, you want to be able to apply pressure, and having the hands and a lot of them allows you to really break boards and grind through decks a lot better. So that's very nice to see. We also see the 2 copies of Crow and Maxx C that I like a lot. Anyone who's been watching the channel for a while knows that I like my 2s and 2s. And even looking ahead a little bit, I do see they are on the others in the side, which is always great to see the playsets finished off. Other than that, I'd say the main deck for the monsters and stuff looks pretty good. Same with the spells. Choosing 1 copy of H.A.T, some people like 2. I've even seen sometimes Ticket at 2, but for the most part, usually 1 and 1 is the way to go. The other thing, though, is they are on a heavier trap lineup, playing 3 Breakthrough Skill, 2 Wing Blast, and 3 copies of Wiretap. Kind of tells me that they were, wanting to grind out with this deck a little more and being able to play through some of that back row. For example, there being so much Geargia that we saw in this event, having extra copies of Wiretap is definitely a good thing. And I guess kind of going into that, a lot of times Madolche will play Trap Stun, and here we're seeing Wiretap instead. But anyways, let's actually go through the card by card real quick, and then we can talk about the side and extra. So for the monsters, they played 2 copies of Crow and 2 Maxx C, 3 Fire Hand, 3 Ice Hand, 3 Angeli, 2 Hootcake, 3 copies of Magellan, the 1 Messengelato, and the 1 copy of Mewtwo. For the spells, they played 1 Dark Hole, 3 copies of Lance, 2 copies of Instant Fusion, the 1 H.A.T, 1 Ticket, and 1 Mind Control. And then for the traps, the 1 Bottomless, 3 copies of Breakthrough Skill, 2 copies of Wing Blast, 1 copy of Warning, 1 Torrential, and 3 copies of Wiretap. Looking at the side deck, as I mentioned before, they are playing the 3rd copy of Crow and the 3rd copy of Maxx C, as well as 1 copy of Valor. You do see Valor pop up from time to time in the Madolche deck, and I feel like Valor's like weird. Sometimes it's good, sometimes it's not. So that is interesting. They are also playing this Xyz monster. I'm guessing they side this in specifically for these copies of Xyz Universe, which we also really don't see in Madolche, but it's a great way to deal with the decks like Geargia, as well as any deck that just generically is going to put up rank 4s. This guy is basically just a 3000 beater that I believe is unaffected by monster effects, if I'm not mistaken. It's the basically Xyz version of Naruto, the moral leader, I think it is, the rank 6 that requires like spellcasters or something. But you're able to just kind of cheat this out again with Xyz Universe, so kind of cool. And then in terms of other cards that they were siding, 3 copies of MST, 3 copies of Blackhorn, and 3 copies of Debunk. So kind of just 3 of the best cards you can be siding generically just against anything. Overall, the side deck looks really cool and or really good, I should say, and that little tech there is very cool. Looking at the extra deck, they played 1 Mavelus and 1 copy of, I think this is called Zombie Warrior. Really, this could be anything. I was kind of looking over this list right now and trying to think if there's any reason that they would play this over. Usually people play like Fusionist, which is a Beast Earth level 3, versus this one is a level 3 Dark. But I personally am not really seeing any synergies there. Maybe it was just their preference of what they wanted to go with. Most of the time it doesn't really matter, except in like specific decks that are trying to, like, for example, make Chidori, or which would be why a lot of people play Mavelus. Or, for example, in Infernity, a lot of people will go with Camion Wizard for the slight bit of attack difference, and into certain other situations with typing and stuff like that. But overall, that doesn't really matter. Moving on, though, 1 copy of Dweller, 1 copy of Direwolf, 1 Exciton, 1 copy of Alucard, 2 copies of Leviair, 2 copies of Tiramisu, 1 copy of Engineer, 1 101, 1 copy of Acid Golem, 1 Black Ship, and 1 Zenmaines. So that's actually something else that I just noticed, that because they're only playing the 1 copy of Messengelato, they actually aren't playing the Invoker. So that is something kind of interesting. It definitely makes sense, because off of Invoker, you would have to summon a level 4 Earth Warrior, and this is your only target, so it makes sense not to take up an extra deck spot for a one of that you're hopefully ideally summoning off of your Hoot Cake to be able to search your spells. So that is something to keep in mind. Other than that, I'd say everything really looks just about as good as it gets. Overall, again, congrats to this player. Really cool to see Madolche finally take down one of these tournaments after such a long time of, barely even seeing it top. So to be able to take down the whole event is definitely cool. And let's move into the next deck list. Next up, we have the Geargia Hands list, and if I'm being completely honest, at a quick glance, this looks like a pretty generic list. So instead of really talking about too much, I'm first just going to go through the whole deck, and then if I see anything interesting or whatever, I'll talk about it. But as of right now, at quick glance, as I mentioned, there really isn't anything to it. They are on the 2 copies of Fire Hand and 2 copies of Ice Hand, which is pretty standard for the Geargia Hands deck. Then there's 3 copies of Accelerator, the 1 Geargiano, and the 3 MK2s, 3 copies of Armor, 3 copies of Accelerator, and 2 copies of Max C. I guess, like, with that, you could be playing Crows. Some people choose to play like 2 Max C, some play 2 Crows. There was even for a while some of the builds playing like 2 Max C and 1 Crow, or 2 Crows and 1 Max C, but just playing 2 of 1 is also just pretty normal. For the spells, 1 Book of Moon, 1 Dark Hole, 3 MST, and 3 copies of Soul Charge. That is, I guess, a little bit different as well. Some of these builds will play like a Mind Control over 3 copies of Soul Charge. Usually for the Geargia Hands deck, you do see them play more than 1 copy of Soul Charge, whereas in like Pure, a lot of times you might see 1 Soul Charge. So seeing that they're playing 3 instead of 2 is also, I guess, something to keep in mind. For the traps, 1 copy of Bottomless, 2 copies of Breakthrough, and 3 Fiendish Chain, 1 copy of Compulse, the 3 Geargia Gear, 1 Needle Sealing, 1 Warning, and 1 copy of Torrential. So I guess the other thing to keep in mind is some builds will main Blackhorn or Trap Trick Trap Hole Nightmare from time to time, or even like Wiretap. And here we're seeing the Needle Sealing, which again is kind of a normal thing. It's just really a preference on a lot of it. So especially with them playing 3 copies of MST, it makes sense why they're not playing like a Trap Stun or Wiretap. So overall, though, like, again, nothing really stands out there. Looking at the side deck, we see 1 copy of Cycle Reader, 3 copies of Crow, and 1 copy of Max C. So again, finishing off the set of Max C and still having 3 copies of Crow is really nice. 1 copy of Dimensional Fissure. Here's the Mind Control here that I had mentioned before. 2 copies of Nobleman, 2 copies of Blackhorn, 3 copies of Debunk, and the Macro Cosmos. Probably putting in Macro when you take out the hands because you don't want that to conflict or anything like that. And moving on to the extra, we see 1 copy of Dweller, 1 copy of Emerald, 1 copy of Exciton, 1 Cowboy, 3 copies of Gear Gigant, 1 copy of Alucard, 1 101, 1 Ragna Zero, 1 copy of Acid Golem, 1 Black Ship, 1 Rhapsody and Berserk, 1 copy of not Heartland Draco, my bad, of Soul of Silver Mountain, my apologies there, and 1 copy of Zenmains. So for a while we had been seeing Temtempo see more play, so here we see that it actually isn't, and it sort of makes more sense. Temtempo, I feel, sees a little more play in the more pure versions of the deck. So I guess that is something to note there. But other than that, it all looks good. So congrats to this player. And let's take a look at that last list, the Mermail deck list. So as mentioned, here is the Mermail list that isn't playing Gen X Undyne, and so I'm looking over this list, and there's a lot to talk about, honestly. Besides Undyne not seeing play, we see that they are on, I guess, starting from the beginning, 2 copies of Aqua Spirit, which a lot of builds don't play at all. This is just a free water extender that can technically also change battle positions of opponents' monsters, so that's something that's a little neat to note, that not only are they playing any at all. Usually when decks would play it, they play 1, but here we are seeing 2 copies. And even moving into the Atlanteans here, they're playing 3 copies of heavy infantry, heavy infantry. And that one is one that for a while we had seen the Mermail lists that were topping actually cutting this down to 1. So rather than playing like 2 which had been standard or 1 which has been becoming standard, here we're seeing actually 3 copies and then 2 copies copies of Marksman. So going a little heavier on that package as well, which sort of makes sense given they are on salvage too, which usually you see salvage in the lists that are over 40 cards. Usually the 45 card builds are playing the salvages and stuff like that, but at the same time, those builds usually are playing 3 Undyne and 2 to 3 copies of Controller. And so going back to that, it's kind of like, what is making this without Controller and Undyne better? And I guess it comes down to this deck inherently does have a lot of normal summons if you really think about it, because if you don't see Sphere or something, you are going to probably want to set or summon and crash your Lind, as well as a lot of times if you have so many different copies of the Atlanteans, you're going to want to maybe go into your Pike as an early starter, even going into your Teus and being able to make plays with that early on is very strong. So my guess would be that they're trying to do something along those lines and not just have, potentially dead controllers in hand a lot of times. I can't tell you how many times you see a Mermail player just open 1, sometimes even 2 copies of the controller, and then they can't even resolve their Undynes, or their hand is just really bad and they're kind of off to a bad start right away. So this kind of makes so their hands are a little more playable, even though they might start a little slower at times. Other than that, we are seeing the 3 copies of Upstart Goblin. For a while, some builds were cutting this and instead playing a handful of just other spells. We're seeing 2 copies of Soul Charge rather than a lot of builds that play 3, and we are seeing 3 copies of Max C. Some builds played no Max C, or they would choose, Max C over Upstart or Upstart over Max C. But here we just see them trying to be as consistent as possible, basically playing a 37 card deck, plus the Max C's, kind of lowers that count as well, which is nice to see. They're still playing a normal amount of traps, playing the 3 copies of Sphere, 2 copies of Breakthrough Skill, and the 1 copy of Torrential. The other thing to note is sometimes when they play the heavier Atlantean count and the salvages, sometimes they'll play Dragon Ice, but it makes sense that they aren't playing Dragon Ice because usually that would pair with Controller to be able to make Beals and stuff like that. And given they aren't on Controller, it doesn't make sense to be playing that either. So honestly, really cool to see this. Let's go through that card by card real quick though. 2 copies of Aqua Spirit, the 1 copy of Dragoons, 3 copies of Infantry, 2 Marksmen, 3 copies of Maxi, 1 Gun, 1 copy of Lead, 2 copies of Megalo. So they are playing, more ways to actually discard their waters, as well as a lot of builds will either play 2 copies of Megalo or 1 and 1. 3 copies of Lin, 3 copies of Pike, 3 copies of Teus, 1 copy of Turge, so they are on the Turge as well, 1 copy of Title, 3 copies of Salvage, 2 copies of Soul Charge, 3 copies of Upstart, 3 copies of Sphere, 2 copies of Breakthrough Skill, and the 1 Torrential. So again, very interesting main deck, but it's really nice to see some innovation and something different with this deck, and it really just shows how good of a player they are to be playing something very unstandard from what the usual would be and do so well with it. Obviously, taking 3rd is very solid. Looking at the side deck, they have the 3 copies of Crow, 1 copy of Dark Hole, 1 copy of Mind Control, 3 copies of MST, 2 copies of Blackhorn, 2 copies of Debunk, and 3 copies of Dust Tornado. This is also really cool because usually Mermail will play something along the lines of Malevolent Catastrophe, or even sometimes they'll do like a Trap Stun or something like that, or just have other traps or back row removal in general. But seeing the 3 copies of Dust Tornado I like a lot. Personally, I think I've shown off in my cat siding stuff that I really kind of like Dust Tornado being able to set your traps afterwards, as well as just having a really nice chainable is sometimes nice. So seeing that's really cool, and overall very solid side deck. Looking at the extra deck, they played 1 copy of Dweller, 1 copy of Bahamut Shark, 1 copy of Direwolf, 1 Exciton, 1 copy of Alucard, 1 Lavalval Chain, 1 copy of Levier, 1 copy of Dracossack, Mechwhip Engineer, Gaios, the copy of Abyss. I don't know why I'm forgetting this name right now. Probably because I just got back from a regional and it's pretty late right now. But the one copy of this one here, I'll see if I can click it real quick. The Abyss Strike, my apologies. Again, it's really late here and I'm just trying to make this as quickly as possible. This video is probably going up the day after this event actually took place. But anyways, let's keep moving on. Enough about that. The one copy of 101, one copy of Big Eye, one copy of Black Ship of Corn, and the one copy of Rhapsody and Berserk. And so obviously we don't see like a Black Rose or a Leo or a Gungnir because they aren't on the controllers. So they do have extra room for just powerful Xyz monsters. And again, it worked well for them. So congrats to this player. But overall, that was this event. You guys can again let me know if you found anything interesting about it or what you think of all those, like, you know, interesting texts and different stuff that we actually got to see in this event. And don't forget to go down to the video description and find the link to the H.A.T Alliance Discord server so you can play in these events. And if you guys enjoyed this video, please leave a like on it. Comment any questions or videos you want to see in the future. Subscribe to the channel, hit the bell to get notified anytime I put a new video out. Share this video with your friends. And anyways, guys, I will see you in the next video.